All right, folks, you having fun? Yeah? Woo! Okay. My name is Noah Wall. I'm the National Director of Grassroots at FreedomWorks, and I'm here today to, somehow I got conned into moderating a panel by my good friend Jason Pye. See, everyone knows Jason here. It's my pleasure today to be helping moderate this panel today on a very important issue that FreedomWorks is engaging on, and I want to make sure that we really leave you guys super educated about, because it's one of the most underrated issues as conservative activists for us to engage on. It's something that we absolutely need to make a difference on. So today on our panel we have Jason Pye, Director of Communications for FreedomWorks. We have Kevin Glass, Director of Outreach and Policy for the Franklin Center, and of course Leon Wolf, Managing Editor at RedState.
I couldn't afford any Chucks. That's why I'm up here on the stage.
Hold the applause.
Nobody's perfect.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about civil asset forfeiture. This is an issue that really has come into the mainstream in the last couple of years, but has been going on for a very long time, and it's something that needs to be addressed. I mean, if I were to tell you that there are ways for the government, whether it be local or federal, to take your property without any due process, without charging you with a crime, you'd think you are not in a Western country. You'd think that you are somewhere else. But unfortunately, that's where we are today, and that is very much where we are at with civil asset forfeiture. We've made tremendous progress, and our panelists will talk about that, but at the end of the day, this is still going on, and this is still a very, very serious issue that we need to deal with, both at the state, federal, and local levels. So with that, I'm actually going to pass it off to Jason to tell us a little bit about the history of this.
Yeah, so we actually have a paper outside at FreedomWorks booth. It's called From High Seas to Highway Robbery: How Civil Asset Forfeiture Became One of the Worst Forms of Government Overreach. And basically, civil asset forfeiture was originally part of maritime law. It was used to enforce tariffs. The English used it against the Danes. It eventually became adopted into English common law and a part of American common law. And it has been progressively worsened as we've gone along. It initially, again, used to enforce tariff laws, but it was used during the Civil War to confiscate property. If you were on the side of the Confederacy or the side of the Union, if you were living in the wrong place, your property could get taken. It became more prominently used during a Prohibition era in the 1920s and early 1930s. And then more recently, it's come into play in the war on drugs. And in civil asset forfeiture cases, you don't have to be arrested, you don't have to be charged with a crime, you don't have to be convicted of a crime. They just take your stuff, they subject it to a very low standard of evidence. In most states, it's a preponderance of the evidence. I think 36 states subject property to forfeiture based on a preponderance of the evidence. And a preponderance of the evidence is a 51% likelihood that the government's claim is more true than it is not. In criminal convictions, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So we're talking about a very far less standard to basically the government be able to take your stuff. In FreedomWorks, we've been engaging, trying to support legislation that would increase the standard of evidence, put the burden of proof on the government. Unfortunately, in many states, I believe it's 35 or 36 states, the burden of proof falls on the property owner. Which is is throwing due process out the window. So we're working to fix these issues at the state level. As a libertarian and a sort of conservatarian, I believe property rights are the cornerstone of liberty. I think everybody in this room would agree with that. The government shouldn't be able to take your stuff without a legitimate reason. We're seeing that right being run roughshod over, and it's got to stop. So we're glad to say that about half a dozen states have passed forfeiture reforms in the past about year and a half. New Mexico passed the gold standard in civil asset forfeiture reform. They require a criminal conviction. Thank you. Montana followed suit. We've seen reforms in Florida, New Hampshire, as well as a few other states since then. So that's something we're going to keep working on at FreedomWorks. And hopefully you guys, you'll hear a lot about this today, and you'll contact your state legislators and learn more about this issue and get them to push for reform in your states. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
So, just actually one question, because I do want to make this pretty Q&A. You mentioned preponderance of evidence standard is used in most states. What's the federal level?
At the federal level, it is a preponderance of the evidence.
Okay.
And there's a perverse profit motive involved as well, which I didn't touch on, that the seizing agency can actually keep up anywhere from part of the proceeds, about 20 to 50%. In some states, it's as high as 100%. At the federal level, the seizing agency can keep up to 80% of the proceeds from seized assets.
So when I talk to conservatives about this issue and people who might be a little hesitant to engage on this issue, I know a lot of very pro-law and order conservatives kind of say, you know, we like to give authorities a fairly wide latitude because if you haven't done anything wrong, you know, you have nothing to hide. What's really important about civil asset forfeiture to understand is that they can do this when you haven't done anything wrong. They can take your money, they can take your property without charging you with a crime. Now, a lot of cases, you know, the citizen can get it back, but like Jason said, the burden is on the person who's had their property seized to get it back rather than on the authorities to prove that they took it for a good reason in the first place. And this happens to everyone. Everyone is susceptible to this. Old, young, rich, poor, white, black, there are cases of every single kind of demographic having their property seized from them by the authorities, both state and federal level. And I wanted to tell a couple different stories along these lines. There was a good one, I think it was 2015 or 2014. Joseph Rivers was I think he was 22 years old from Michigan. He decided he wanted to follow his dreams. So he got his life savings. This was $22,000, I think. And he was heading to California to try and make it in the music industry, to have a music career. He's on the train. He's stopped in Albuquerque by DEA agents. And basically, if you're traveling with a large amount of cash, the authorities will accuse you of wanting to use that cash in the drug trade.
Simply because he was going to Los Angeles,
right,
which is a drug hub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's actually fairly common, is someone saying, well, you're going to a place where we know there's drug activity, so we're going to say that you're going to use this large amount of cash, even though obviously he's going for the entertainment industry.
How many of you from out of state, you're here in Colorado? Yeah.
A lot of drug activity in Colorado.
Yeah.
Possession of more than about $10,000 in cash is considered more or less per se evidence of criminal activity sufficient to allow the cops to take it from you.
And the DEA took his money. They took $22,000, his life savings, away from him, just because they were able to say, we think that you're going to use this in the drug trade. There was another good example. Sorry, I have them written down here, and I want to get the names right. Victor Ramos.
Not yet.
He is being represented by some nonprofit organizations trying to get his money back. The Institute for Justice is a really great organization that's been doing some work on this issue. But Victor Ramos Guzman, he's a legal immigrant from El Salvador to the United States. He worked for the Pentecostal Church, and he was traveling in Virginia on I-95, which is a road that I frequent on. He had $28,000 in parishioners' donations. The cops stopped him. They said, we think you're going to use this $28,000 for drugs, and they took his money. And this happens all over the country. Some people get their money back. Some people are still fighting. But one of the biggest problems are, by and large, the cases that we don't hear about are the cases where they're not getting their money back.
Low dollar seizures.
Exactly. There are lower dollar seizures or from impoverished communities where they don't have the resources to fight the authorities on some of these issues. So it's something that I think conservatives should be concerned about. And like Jason said, property rights are so important here, where, you know, these are cases that these people don't do anything wrong. They haven't done anything wrong. And the authorities say, we think you're doing something wrong. We're taking this money from you. We're not charging you with a crime. And you're going to have to prove yourself to get it back. And that's why I think that conservatives everywhere who are concerned about property rights should be really concerned about this. And it's great that there's a lot of movement at the state level to do some of these good reforms, like Jason said, some of the gold standard reforms that we're seeing across the country. But, you know, more action is always needed, and it has still been happening all over the country.
So, next question I want to ask, Leon, what aspect of civil asset forfeiture law troubles you the most? Like, what's the aspect to you that really gets on your nerves?
It's difficult to separate out, but I would say the main thing is the part that that the burden of proof is on the property owner rather than the government. That's, I think, number one, the problem. Because I assume I'm on this panel. In a past life, I was a white-collar criminal defense attorney. Like up until last year, I was a practicing attorney. And so there are a lot of criminal sanctions, especially as applied to corporation, for which the punishment is a fine, right? So if you're going to charge criminally a company, the company does not go to jail. The company pays a fine of several $1 million or whatever the case is. So the government wants to take $12 million from a company that they believe has polluted and done some criminal pollution, right? That's absolutely something they can do. They have to go and get a grand jury to indict, and then they got to turn over all their discovery. They go through the plea bargain process. We have a trial. You can be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. Then they probably don't get to hold the money during the pendency of the appeal. All this stuff happens, okay? Or, same exact set of facts. They could say, well, you used these assets in the course of committing this crime. We'll just take the money, and if you want to get it back, you can come prove that you didn't commit the crime. And I think that that's a fundamental aspect of due process that's important, is that the government bears the burden of proving that you're not entitled to your life, liberty, and property. You don't bear the burden of proving that you are entitled to it. I mean, you own it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, any high school civics student should be able to tell you that's on the burden of, the government to prove that. So getting to that, what does the ideal civil asset forfeiture reform look like?
I think it's New Mexico's law. A civil asset or a forfeiture proceeding has to be tied to a criminal conviction. The burden of proof in those cases falls on the government. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. There are a couple other aspects to forfeiture law that I think we're going to discuss, but another one is closing off the federal loophole through the equitable sharing program. A lot of people don't know that the federal government drives a lot of forfeitures at the state and local level because states use it to circumvent protections in states, or state and local law enforcement will use these federal laws to circumvent protections in state laws. That's one reason the New Mexico law was so high on the gold. It's why we call it the gold standard, is because it cut off the loophole. Unfortunately, we've seen other states try to move on similar legislation, such as California. California actually has, oddly enough, despite being the People's Republic of California, actually has pretty good forfeiture laws. But they tried to close the federal loophole. The Department of Justice got involved and basically threatened them that they would decertify them from the federal equitable sharing program, and it killed the bill in the state assembly. It had already passed the Senate. But at the very least, I think the criminal conviction, closing the federal loophole, making sure the burden of proof falls on the property, on the government.
I think, to me, as a conservative, I believe that liberals oftentimes use the court system to try to have the court system resolve political issues instead of legal ones. This is not one of those cases to me. It is a legal constitutional issue. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution says no person shall be deprived of their life, their liberty, their property without due process of law. What needs to happen is that the Supreme Court needs to recognize nationwide that the way this is being practiced right now violates the Constitution. And all civil asset forfeiture current statutes in place that don't meet X, Y, and Z that Jason talked about are unconstitutional on their face and thrown out.
Absolutely.
I think that's the reform. That's the number one reform that needs to occur. And maybe I'm just kind of an absolutist on this, but
no, the reform we need to follow is the Fifth Amendment. We already have the reform in place. We just need to start following it.
Yeah, and so to me, I normally am absolutely, anytime we come to talk about reform, I say the right way, number one, we go to the states and we ask states to pass laws. There's a lot of bad laws in place, and number one needs to happen is they need to be stricken from the books. And if states want to come back and put good laws into place that are in compliance with what the Fifth Amendment says, I'm totally fine with that. And I would also note that this is another way, this happens a lot in connection with things that are not just your standard kind of somebody's caught with cash and it's assumed that they're running drugs. Okay, so there was a story in the paper a couple of weeks ago about the government seizing all these people's cherries. Did you all see that? So this is incredible. This really gets my my few libertarian bones going. The agricultural policy in this country is insane. That the government can tell you if you grow some crops on your own land when you can and can't sell it, and they'll come in and tell you, you have to throw it away, okay? That's a thing. Well, we had some cherry farmers who were upset by that. They were like, we grew this, it's our property, we're gonna go sell it. Lo and behold, turns out, as we talked about yesterday, that's a criminal penalty, essentially, for disregarding agricultural regulations in that way.
FDR.
And they came and took like 87 million tons of people's cherries. I mean, just took them. There are cherries now. I mean, I assume they went and burned them or something, but it happens in ways that are not kind of connected with the traditional case that makes people think, maybe these people are probably carting drugs anyway. But
One smaller level reform that I think would help actually a lot of the behavior of local authorities is, and Jason probably knows which states still have this in place, and it often varies by jurisdiction, but many local police departments are funded through the civil asset forfeiture that they can take. So if a cop stops you, you got a bunch of cash in your car, he's incentivized to take that cash from you because it's going to fund his police department. Yeah. And I know there are a couple states that have done reforms where that money actually goes into the general fund of the government.
New Mexico being one of them. Yeah.
New Mexico being one of them. But that is a really good way to combat the actual abusive behaviors by the authorities themselves. And obviously that's a much smaller level thing than getting the Supreme Court to recognize that the Fifth Amendment. But I think it's a good and small and first step towards protecting people in some of these individual traffic stop cases.
The question I have, with some of these cases that we were talking about, Joseph Rivers, and you have a couple others that you listed out, we talked about it earlier, but since when did carrying cash become a crime?
yeah.
I mean, it is not illegal to carry large sums of money. I don't. I'm poor. But I mean, if I wanted to carry 10 grand, that's my prerogative to do that.
If you wanted to cash out your life savings and start a punk band and travel the country,
I would do that tomorrow if I could. But I just don't understand. I understand that when we travel internationally, yes, the FAA or there are regulations in place that prevent you, or you have to claim anything over $10,000. But domestically, there is no statute. There is no regulation that prevents you from carrying as much money as you want to. And we just assume, the law enforcement, prosecutors just assume that this person must be up to no good. I'm sorry, that is not what we were founded on. That is completely unconstitutional.
The first story, I'm sorry, I'll let you get. The first story I heard that brought this issue to my attention, and you guys might remember this, was a story about 7-8 years ago. There was a woman who was an exotic topless dancer in Los Angeles. You guys remember this story?
I haven't heard this story.
She was 23 years old, and from doing her exotic dancing, she had already accumulated over $1 million in cash. So she must have been one heck of a dancer. However, she was not perhaps the most business-savvy person in the world, because what she had been doing with this stuff is she just took the money every night with whatever germs were on there and put it in a suitcase, right? And so she decided she was going to move to New Jersey. She's getting out of that life. She's going to go own a bar. Her and her brother are going to purchase a bar. Cops catch her traveling across the country. They asked to search her trunk. She said, sure, you can look in my trunk, never thinking anything wrong. They looked. They never, in the whole process, were able to articulate literally anything that she did other than carrying cash. And it took her 2.5, 3, they messed with the wrong stripper, I will tell you, because she took them to court, got all her money, and got several $100,000 in attorney's fees back from the government.
Great.
Because they were never, but it is ridiculous. I never carry cash myself personally because I have it on a debit card, but man, if you want to carry all of your money around in a bag, I wouldn't advise it, but I think you should be able to do it.
No, I agree, but as I mentioned earlier, I agree, but I think there are a couple particular instances. There's this guy who was in Georgia, and I forget his name. I wrote an op-ed about this maybe last year. He had something like $40,000 in cash, and the reason he carried cash, he didn't trust banks. Right. I mean, I don't particularly care for banks. I don't really trust banks. Call it my skepticism of the Federal Reserve, but I don't trust banks. But he had every pay stub. He had all the documentation he needed to show that the cash was his. The law enforcement still took his cash. Now, he eventually got it back, but he spent over $12,000 fighting it. Most people, you're going up against the government, whether it's the federal government, local government, the IRS, because the IRS can do this too, by the way. They look at it and they're like, I'm fighting the government. This is too big a battle for me to fight. This is one reason we have to tackle reform. We have to go after it. And unfortunately, one thing I saw just this morning, a state representative in Georgia, his name is Scott Turner. He lives in the Woodstock area, just north of Atlanta. He told me that there's a prosecutor in Macon, Bibb County, Georgia, who's been caught falsifying evidence against people just to make it easier to forfeit property. I'm all for law enforcement. As I mentioned yesterday on the panel, my dad was a police officer in the city of Atlanta and city of Forest Park. But something's got to change. This is not anti-law enforcement. This is fixing laws that have been broken by lawmakers. We have to fix it.
So on that topic, what do we say? I mean, as conservatives, we are generally very supportive of law enforcement, and very appreciative of the work that they do. What do we say to the law enforcement who believe that this is a key part of their arsenal of tactics?
Can you take that one?
Sure, it's a problem. It's a very difficult communicative issue, and one of the reasons that there was a lot of public support for this a long time ago is that people had this idea of law enforcement busting giant drug dealers. So actually, asset forfeiture laws were used to take down Pablo Escobar. And in the kind of 1980s, when a lot of this started to ramp up, and you can see over the years how much asset forfeiture has been used, it's multiplied multiple times over the last 30 years, is that the cops said, we need these laws to be able to take down these people who are genuine threats to law and order, to civil society. And that's all well and good, but the problem is when those laws have been taken and they're applied to these not giant drug dealers, they're applied to low-level criminals, yes, but also non-criminals.
Like the hotel owner in Tewksbury, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Russ Caswell.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's another story is Caswell, he was a 72-year-old motel owner in Massachusetts, and as a motel owner, sometimes illicit activity goes on on your property, but he had always been fully cooperative with law enforcement. Yeah. One day he gets a letter from I think it was the locals, that they were taking his motel from him, just taking it straight up, because they suspected that he was involved or his property was involved. I'm not even sure what the rationale was, but they just said, we're going to take your motel. There's bad stuff happening here. And he had to go through the courts. He spent, I'm not sure how much money fighting this, but even he won eventually. A judge said to the prosecutors, what could he have done differently to get you to not take his motel? And the prosecutor couldn't say a single thing. He had always cooperated with law enforcement, always worked with them, obviously did not want illicit things happening on his property, on his small business, and they wanted to take it anyway. So it's when you're applying these laws to completely law-abiding citizens that the abuse, it's gotten so bad that something needs to be fixed.
And I cringe when I heard you ask the question because I hate the premise of it. And this goes to something we talked about on our criminal justice reform panel yesterday. Using the police to fix any revenue problem is a huge way to promote disrespect for the law in a community. And that is one of the things that we saw. It is one of the things that we saw in the DOJ's report about Ferguson, is part of the reason the community and the police had such a hostile relationship, whatever you think about what happened with Michael Brown, is that the city council essentially forced their police department to go out and treat the black community as a piggy bank. Yeah. And stop them and collect traffic tickets. And it's not just that, it's civil asset forfeiture is the same thing. So my response to a policeman who came to me and said, we need this for our program, would be to say, in as polite a way as I could muster, what you need to do is to go back to your city council and tell them to put enough money in the budget to do what you want to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we have some sort of revenue program or problem, they need to go to the voters and sell the voters on the fact that we need to raise revenue in some other way. That's the proper way to address that situation, I think.
And to go back to what Kevin was saying a second ago about the Caswells in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, one of the things, there was a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee last year. Senator Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the committee, it was actually tax day, oddly enough, and he brought Mr. Caswell to testify. And Senator Grassley had to get out and leave at one point, and who took his place was Senator Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III. And Senator Sessions, it made my blood boil because he actually looked at Mr. Caswell and just suggested that he was in some way guilty of facilitating a crime because illicit activity happened on his property, even though he didn't know about it. I don't know why anybody would say something so profoundly stupid. And sorry, I'm bluntly honest, it's a character flaw. But I just don't understand why anybody would say that. Thankfully, we are seeing some movement at the federal level. For those of you who are interested in this, there's a piece of legislation called the Due Process Act. It's been introduced in the House by Congressman Sensenbrenner. Companion legislation's been offered in the Senate by Chairman Grassley. Hopefully we'll see some movement on that very soon.
So, and that may be the bill that I'm hoping for us to talk about, but the IRS has used federal forfeiture laws to seize bank accounts based on the belief that some are trying to skirt federal bank reporting requirements. What's our approach to tackling that at the federal level?
So on Tuesday, I had to go out to Athens, Georgia, go Dogs, and I just happened to drive by Clyde Armory. Clyde Armory it's a gun store owned by a guy named Andrew Clyde, who's an Iraq War veteran. A few years back, he was depositing money in his bank account, frequently under $10,000, which the IRS viewed as an attempt to skirt the Bank Secrecy Act. If any deposit over $10,000 has to be reported under the Bank Secrecy Act. And frequent deposits under $10,000 can trigger some sort of, you can fall on the IRS's radar. So business was very good at the time, obviously with President Obama and his gun-grabbing attitude. Business was very good at the time. So he was making a lot of money, had $950,000 in his account, doing very well. The IRS came in and took it, all of it. He had to fight 2 years, I think is what he took. He eventually got $900,000 back. He surrendered $50,000. He called it a tactical retreat because he's like, I want to live to fight another day. I want to get some of my money back. He was obviously, when $950,000, almost $1 million is taken from you, it puts a little strain on business. But he's spending the rest of his public life now fighting civil asset forfeiture at the federal level. Thankfully, some changes have happened, those administrative changes by the DOJ and the IRS. It's one of the few good things that has happened under this administration. They are no longer, we call it structuring. That's what the word is, the term is. You're structuring deposits under $10,000 to avoid these reports. So they rolled it back. The IRS can no longer take money where structuring is the only offense that is suspected. Unfortunately, this hasn't been codified into federal law yet. And it's not good policy to make an administrative change without codifying it into law. So the Due Process Act would do that. There's another piece of legislation introduced by Congressman Roscom that would do it as well, but the Due Process Act touches more than just the IRS aspect of it. It touches the policing aspect of it as well. So, just to give some credit where credit's due, the administration actually did something right for once.
Well, one last question before we open it up for the audience. For the state-based reforms that we need to make for some of these changes, to the extent we know them, what are our targets for the upcoming state legislative sessions in spring?
Right now, this is right now. Ohio has a piece of legislation. It's House Bill 347. It was introduced in the House by State Representative Rob McCauley. The bill has already passed the House. It's sitting in the Senate right now. FreedomWorks activists have submitted more than 40,000 messages to state senators in Ohio urging them to take this piece of legislation up. So that's number one, and we hope to see some action on that very soon.
How many of you guys from Ohio? Raise your hands. A few of you guys would really appreciate your help working on this.
Yeah, please contact your state senators and ask them to take action on that bill. Happy to give you more information on it. There's also legislation introduced in Pennsylvania, but we expect that Oklahoma is going to be, if you're from Oklahoma, that's going to be a target state next year. Hopefully Texas, Georgia, a few others, and just please, if you live in those states, please contact me, and I'm happy to help you out in a way that we can give you model legislation. We can tell you what the principles of reform are. You can read our literature. anything we could do to help you out of it. And I know Kevin and Leon would be more than happy to help out as well. But
And, yeah, go ahead.
no, that's all I have to say about
And
that.
you know, also in addition to that, I mean, educate yourself about your local enforcement agencies, because I do want to say there are a lot of agencies who voluntarily seize almost no property. There are a lot of good police departments out there who refuse to do this. There are some, though. Anybody live in Philadelphia?
The worst civil asset forfeiture court in the country.
Because your stuff is not safe if you live in Philadelphia. They seize over $2 million of property a year
Yeah.
by the city of Philadelphia police.
And-
$2 million. I wouldn't have thought there would be that much.
And we talk about the bad that civil asset forfeiture. We're not even getting into the legal proceedings in Philadelphia. And the American Civil Liberties Union, regardless of what your opinion is of the ACLU, has been doing great work on this. And they actually did a lot on Philadelphia itself. If you miss, you may have to go to court up to 10 times to even try to get to have any hope of getting your property back. If you miss one hearing, your property is administratively forfeited.
And here's the thing about what's going on in Philadelphia. The cops come and take your stuff. First of all, generally what they'll do a lot of times is seize your bank account, or they've taken all the cash that you have on your hand. That's generally your liquidity that you possibly have. So you're mad, you're gonna fight, you're gonna call some jerk like me. I'm gonna tell you, I need a $5,000 retainer and the final bill's gonna be probably 3 times that. So how does Philadelphia get away with this? I'm probably thinking, you're asking, so how does a city like that get away with this? Because they seize it at amounts they know that people are not gonna have the willingness and the resources to go fight. Why would you spend $15,000 to get the $5,000 used car that they took back?
Well, the average forfeiture, the average dollar figure on the seizures in Philadelphia was $200. You wouldn't fight to get that back. I wouldn't fight to get it back. Just go out and make another $200 and have it seized again, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that we are going to open this up for questions. Does anyone have any questions on this?
Just one?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Todd Hathorn from New Mexico. So you talked about the gold standard, and New Mexico being that case. 2 items. First, I want to thank Freedom Works for the work that they did to help pass that. I wish I could take full credit, but the calls you generated did have pressure on the governor. The prosecutor, former prosecutor, who's now our governor, was very reluctant to sign, and part of that was because of the policing for profit. You just call it what it was.
Well,
and she was literally shamed into the position of actually signing it because of the circumstances. 2 items that weren't mentioned in the discussion is that we're talking about police forces that are policing for profit, but more and more we see other agencies that are involved in this, and they are much less reluctant to. There was a lawsuit, or a gun case in Deming, New Mexico, where they took the cash, but they also took the gun shop's guns, took all of their inventory, put them out of business, wiped out the business, and they were affiliated through permission with ATF through, yes, Fast and Furious. The questions that involved around that case was one of the examples used to push that law in New Mexico. The second is, after that law was passed, 2 state senators on either side of the aisle sued in New Mexico in order to get enforcement from APD, Rio Rancho Police Department in particular, but other police agencies, and the judiciary actually rejected it based on standing. And so now we have a place where the law's not being enforced, even though it's so well written. Can you talk about getting down into those lower levels of government and how that enforcement can be handled? And one last thing, Mr. Wolf, I finally understand a little bit more now that I know you're an attorney.
Yes.
Well, one
So
thing
many things become clear.
Before
Sure,
you
go
jump
ahead.
into this. So Freedom Works, we actually found out that she was leaning towards vetoing that bill maybe 3 or 4 days before we actually started taking action on it. In 72 hours, Freedom Works drove 5,000 calls to Governor Susana Martinez's office, urging her to sign that bill into law. As reluctant as she was, I don't believe she would have done it if our guys, our activists, our community had not taken the steps they did to get her to do that. But there's another aspect. It wasn't just there were certain examples certainly of that led to this happening in New Mexico. But when you have a city attorney from Las Cruces going out and calling seized or anything that could be seized little goodies, and then bragging that they could own the city, they could be czars, they could get in the real estate business, our work is pretty much done for us.
Yeah.
I think the policing for profit, I mean, that phrase has been used by activists and it's a great phrase. I think the point you made about the seizure of property itself, non-cash, obviously, they seize used cars, they seize very small amount, like trinkets and stuff like that. The one thing they don't seize are drugs. They hate seizing drugs. If someone's driving along a known drug route, they will wait until after the drug deal is done so they can seize the cash, not the drugs.
Leon was talking about this yesterday because it happens a lot in Nashville, area.
We've I-40 is a drug corridor. I think all highways are drug corridors.
The police do too.
Yeah, that's exactly. But apparently the trade goes east, the cash comes back west, and the news always shows they write more tickets and stops 85% on the left-hand side of the highway as opposed to the right.
And they can take the cash, no court case, no accusations, very clean. Just take your money and give it to the police.
And one thing we
here's
need to touch on is the property is on trial, not the person. That's why you get court cases that are called United States versus $140,000 in United States currency, or Texas versus one gold crucifix. Actual court name. We checked and see this. There's actually a case brought up against kittens. It was like United States versus like 20 cats or something like that.
Yeah, it's
so weird.
So
Shark fins. There's actually one that's shark fins too.
Here's the importance of the fact of what Jason and Kevin have mentioned about the fact that it's been essentially unhitched from criminal law. There doesn't have to be a charge filed. The reason that's important, and this goes to the agency's issue as well, when the IRS takes your money or the Department of Agriculture takes your crops or whatever the situation is, the reason it's important for it to be part of a criminal process is that the criminal process has a number of deadlines where the government has proving points. They have to, and if they don't meet them, they have to give your stuff back as an automatic mess. So they got to have probable cause to seize you and the car or whatever that they think those used drugs, okay? Then they're going to have to defend that at a preliminary hearing. Then they're going to have to go get an indictment. Then they're going to have to survive a motion to dismiss. Then they're going to have to prove their case at trial. Then they're going to have to prove their case at appeal. Any step along the way they fail, guess what? Automatically you get your stuff back. So if they get, and there's also a constitutional requirement that your case has to be heard within 6 months is generally accepted now, or they have to let you go anyway. So that's a built-in prevention to keep people from just keeping your stuff indefinitely and kind of getting around to it when they get around to it. And I think that it's important way to combat this problem of the agencies taking it is, look, it's got to be part of a criminal proceeding. And people kind of pass over, it's said as something that's an outrage, that they don't have to charge you, but it's important for other reasons. Let's put this within the criminal court process so that it's treated speedily and people get their money back automatically if the government can't prove it.
Well, next question.
So I got a simple question. This has been going on for a long time. It's a Fifth Amendment issue. Why has not a single case reached Supreme Court yet?
Actually, the cases have reached the Supreme Court. There was, unfortunately, the court has deferred to state legislatures and Congress. You guys I don't know how many of you are lawyers, but if you've ever heard the term judicial deference, they just defer to the legislature and let them run roughshod over our rights. The one case, I mentioned different cases in this white paper outside, but one case that I'm familiar with is Bennis v. Michigan. That was an innocent owner case. The wife sued to get a car that was seized by the state of Michigan back. Her husband had a little too much fun with a prostitute, and but the car was the vehicle that the crime was committed in, so they seized it. She fought to get it back. The court denied her. The Supreme Court denied her. And we actually talk a little bit about the background of the civil asset forfeiture at the Supreme Court. It's just they have just constantly deferred.
And it's, as a lawyer, the Supreme Court has gone through kind of a lot of peaks and valleys with terms of criminal jurisprudence. I mean, I think, probably prior to the 40s or 50s, there was an almost total deference to law enforcement. And then you had the Warren Court, which went so far the other way. And I think there has been somewhat of the pendulum swinging back. I think that Scalia and Thomas are actually pretty good on civil liberties, and I think a lot of liberals will respect that. Rehnquist and O'Connor and Kennedy have not been as much so, and that's one of the reasons that it's been frustrating to see it kind of languish at the Supreme Court. Scalia, people attack him for being conservative, but he takes the Constitution seriously, and he and Thomas look at this thing. Some of the judges that were appointed in the Reagan-Bush era, though, were kind of more cultural conservatives, and they were like, well, whatever the cops want to do will be fine. So it'll be interesting to see how this issue is going forward, because I do think we're probably going to come to, sooner or later, one way or the other, we're going to come to a deal where I think the Supreme Court's going to step in and weigh on this in a favorable way.
All right, next question, please.
Okay. I was just curious, what was the smallest amount that they've taken that you know of, and what their excuse was? Like, if it's a couple $100, how could you be going to buy drugs or do drug deals? And the other part of my question is, I'm fixing to move to Las Vegas. What do you know about them there?
Actually, I think. Well, I actually don't know. The smallest one I've seen is like a few $1,000s. I'm sorry to disappoint. I actually don't have a really good example. I know of, there are the ACLU report that came out of Philadelphia. They do talk about some seizures that took place in an apartment complex. They actually went into the wrong room, but they still seized the money anyway. And I think it was a few $100s. That they just didn't give an actual name of the person. There's an interesting case in Michigan, though. It was actually a license, and medical marijuana is legal in Michigan. They actually seized the child's piggy bank, and I'm not going to say what else they seized, but they seized an item that involved personal intimacy, and according to the woman to whom it belonged. And so those are some obscure examples at the very least. But as far as
What would be wrong with
but Nevada, I don't know too much about Nevada law. I think Nevada is generally better than the average in the states, but still work need to be done.
Jason can get mad at me, but we do actually have a pamphlet at our booth that does describe, we actually grade the 50 states on this, so you can actually check that out.
And the Institute for Justice does as well. They have a great report on that.
And I mean, like Jason said earlier, the average seizure in Philadelphia is $200. So it's the cases that you don't hear about that are the biggest nuisances to average Americans everywhere. And that's the biggest threat to everyone. That we all, as activists, can make a big deal when they seize $6,000, when they seize $20,000, but when they seize $200, when they seize your 1992 Saturn that you're about to junk anyway, that's when you're not inclined to fight, and that's the biggest kind of everyday tyranny that goes on here.
The kind of bizarre cases that you see where $2 worth of stuff is seized is just a real common occurrence. If you're riding in a car with someone and the police stop that person and say, we believe this car is being used in drugs. So you've taken out a CD or something and put it in there. They seize the contents of the car, including everything you have in there. So the passengers' backpacks or whatever will be in there, and they'll all be part of the seizure, whatever happens to be in there. So, and then you see, it is the United States versus
One gold crucifix. I'm not sure how much
it's
2,000
like
shark fins, 2,000
that's
pounds
how
of
those
shark
kinds
fins.
of things happen.
Unfortunately, I don't think so. But no, I mean,
Right.
When you go home, please contact your state legislators. And we only have about a minute and 30 seconds here, but please contact your state legislators. Find out how you can help either guide legislation in the right way, how your state laws are. Use FreedomWorks, the Franklin Center, and some of Leon's work at RedState as influencers. Also look at the Institute for Justice. Our friends at Right on Crime do good work on this as well. In Faith and Freedom Coalition, as well as Americans for Tax Reform, we're all part of a coalition called the U.S. Justice Action Network. And we can all be resources for you. You don't have to come to FreedomWorks. You can come to any one of those groups or even other groups that engage on the issue. We're happy to help out. But I just want to impress upon as conservatives and libertarians, again, I just go back to my earlier point. Property rights are the cornerstone of liberty. The right to trade that property, the right to simply possess that property, the right to do with that property what you see fit. It's your decision, it's your right. You shouldn't have to explain yourself if you're not being arrested, if you're not being charged, if you're not being convicted of a crime. You shouldn't have to explain yourself to anyone. And I hope that's something that you guys go home and take back with you back in your states. Thank you.
All right, please give these guys a big round of applause.